We're back. Talking about World War One. All right, so this famous image right here. It's all about the CPI and its effort to persuade society to buy into this war. So all over newspapers, billboards. I'll show you some music, play some music. It has to do with this kind of stuff. Let's look at propaganda. The definition: one-sided information for a purpose of getting the public to support a cause. Purposes. In this case, for World War I, they're going to making people want to join the military. We'll talk about conserving resources, what they targeted as specific items in which the United States people in society shouldn't use so that the soldiers could have enough of it. Buying war bonds, giving your money to the government. They'll give it back to you if they win. And loving your country and hating the enemy. Creating someone that you could fight against at home without physically being there abroad. The results are millions of people volunteered, and you had a common enemy amongst most Americans, and the government generated tons of money through the sale of these war bonds. Okay, how it's used. You've learned this in English stuff, right? Pathos, logos, ethos, that kind of stuff. So here's what it does. You get a bunch of posters, put them all around so people continually see over and over again, whether they consciously or subconsciously realize they're being persuaded. Those that couldn't read, it's easy for them to be able to understand. Sometimes you get the facts twisted, sometimes it's not even correct, but it appeals to some sort of feeling or emotion, not logic. They'll use symbolism, okay? Things that will represent ideas, that sometimes might be myths. We'll talk about some slogans. So here's types of propaganda. Bandwagon. Everybody else is doing it, so you should do it. Testimonials. Famous people. Trusted people. They try to persuade you with their ideas. Transfer. Pictures and famous people being able to show you that they're doing it, so therefore you should be able to do it. Emotional pleas. Making you feel something, either positive or negative. And then the name calling parts, looking at the other side and showing you how bad they are. Or looking at the good side and showing you how great they are. So glittering generalities. Let's take a look and see what you can find within these images of World War I. This one. You got the German U-boats, right, in the background. And then you have the lettering, the words, every Liberty bond is a shot at a U-boat. So you can't physically take down a U-boat, you general, regular American. But if you lend money to the government, then you can help sink a German U-boat. Here's a couple. Do you want a fern basket like this? If you look at it, the fern basket is a German helmet. So you could have a trophy. If you join the 6th, then come get one. And you could put your German basket, you can throw a fern in there and it can be part of your household decorations. On the other side, you get the lions, right? This little that kind of Lion King thing here. So the empire needs men. All answer the call. Helped by the young lions, the old lion defies his foes. Enlist now. Now you look at that and you go, oh, okay, like some young people are helping some old people. But if you really look at it and think contextually, the old lion is Britain. And the young lions then would be the United States. The old lion's having trouble defeating Germany. And the young United States, who used to be a part of used to be a part of Britain, could then now help defeat Germany. This one, you're looking at evil, right? You look at German Empire as Satan, so that kind of propaganda presenting them as the worst part of humanity. Again, Germany depicted as the Hun. So if you buy Liberty bonds, you give the government your money. then you can, again, do your part and beat back the Hun. Over there on the right, you have defeat Kaiser and his U-boats. Victory depends on which fails first, food or frightfulness. Okay, so you're looking at rationing and what foods you're allowed to eat, what you're not allowed to eat, and how that is then going to defeat Germany. Here's one that are towards women. Wake up, America. Civilization calls every man, woman, and child. So over there on the left, you have sleeping on the job. There's things to do, whether you're a man, woman, or child. Okay, protecting all civilization. Everybody has some sort of role within World War I. We'll talk about what they expected women to do here in a second. Destroy this mad brute. Enlist in the army. And if you can see here, this is supposed to be Germany, which is the King Kong figure, taking women, innocent figures, helpless figures, and then has reached America. And so they want you to enlist in the army so that does not occur. These are interesting ones. Together we win. United States Shipping Board on the left. And so you have these three different figures, a working man and some soldiers arm in arm. Different parts of the military. So they're all happy and jolly. They are all working together, arm in arm. There's going to be stuff to be done at home, and then those abroad are going to do their job. On the right, when the boys come home, while I was over there, what were you doing here? And this one's targeting students, young people. And would they enlist or would they go to school, right? So if you go to college, 2-4 years, right? And then the war's over and you just got an education and the soldiers coming back saying like, you guys went to school while we fought for freedom. It's getting that feelings of emotion to be able to persuade you, hey, put off school, go fight for your freedom. These are about rationing. So Uncle Sam needs that extra shovelful. I'm talking about coal, saving coal. Okay, so saving energy and stopping the overuse of coal and heat. Or electricity, in which coal was used to be able to power electrical plants and things like that to produce light at night. So light consumes coal, save the light, save coal. You can do your part at home. Here's the song. You can play this. That's not the song. This is the song. I'll put the words up. Loading, loading, loading.
Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Hear them calling you and me, every son of liberty. Hurry right away, no delay, go today. Make your daddy glad to have had such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to mind, to be proud her boys in line. Over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming,
sorry about that.
the Yanks are coming, the drums coming everywhere, so prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware, we'll be over,
Alright, everybody now.
coming over, and we won't come back.
Can't hear you back there. Alright, you get the idea. Oop, that's the next one. Preview. Sneak, sneak. Loading. Here's a simple one. He is keeping the world safe for democracy. Enlist and help. These are more interesting ones. Daddy, what did you do during the Great War? As a little girl asks her father, sitting on his lap while the little boy plays with the soldiers down there on the floor. As he ponders, what did I do during the war? Nothing? And how would he be perceived amongst his family or society if he did not participate? The other one on the right is more of the acceptable gender equality or inequalities of the time. Gee, I wish I were a man. I'd join the Navy because the women couldn't. So therefore, you're not a man if women want to do it, and you're not going to do it as a man. Your country, your call. Is this worth fighting for? Again, women and their role, saving your country by by war-saving stamps. Okay, so what do they do with the economy? All right, you persuade people with the CPI, you get them on board, and then you got to change the economy in some way. They did this during the Civil War. If you can remember back to the Civil War and what Lincoln did to be able to control the North. Conversion of industrial plants from war materials. Okay, so you're making shoes. Now you're making war boots. You're making steel. Now you're making steel for ships. Those kinds of things that the government then paid for the industrial plants to not only just make regular items for consumers, but for the government to be able to use in this war effort, being able to use it for the United States and selling it to their allies. So all this brings standardization. This is going to be key to understanding something similar with World War II, but also then what happens in the Roaring Twenties with standardization. So we'll get to that later. It'll be quite interesting within the connections for some of you. For others of you, you're like, just keep going. Food and Fuel Act. This allows the government to be able to regulate the production of food and the distribution of fuel. Okay, so the fuel would be the stuff we talked about in those propagandas about coal. Daylight savings time comes about during World War One. So that was a theory in which you could save energy by letting the light out later. So they use that as well. Liberty bonds raised about $23 billion with a B. So convincing people that they could give up part of their money. Now remember that it's going to create jobs, so more people are going to be working, which means a good economy, more money, which will allow them to be able to give it away to the government to be able to get it back with interest. It's like a savings account. Debt does go from $1 billion to $20 billion. So again, the United States will owe its own people most of that money. For food, this is your guy, Herbert Hoover, who will later become president at the end of the 20s. He will be in charge of this and gain popularity through the federal government with his food administration. So what does it do? It increases agricultural production. Okay? It gets more grown from farmers. It supervises then the food distribution and farm labor. And this successful campaign was led again through propaganda to be able to get people to eat less bread and less meat, to eat more beans and stuff that they could save the bread and meat to be able to go across the ocean to be able to use in Europe during World War I. So these became known as Hooverize your servings. So eating less so the soldiers could eat more. These are some of the propagandas about rationing. Food is not ammunition, but they related it to become ammunition. So just like don't waste your food, you don't just waste ammunition. Immigrants, context, coming to the United States, it drops significantly. Like there hardly any immigrants, hardly any migration itself across the entire world was happening during World War I. But to convince these other people that were not yet Americanized or assimilated into the United States, these were the targets of the one propaganda poster on the right. Again, women. Are you going to help the women of France? You can help them. You don't have to leave. You don't have to go to France. You can help them in the United States. Save wheat. Be patriotic. On the left, women again. Sign your country's pledge to save food. You can see there at the bottom, U.S. Food Administration. So a whole propaganda machine was created to convince people what they could do within the United States to help the soldiers and help win without actually fighting physically in the war. Here's some more. You can create your own victory garden, right? On the left, you could grow your own food, can it, and look, you can have fun with your kids at the same time, right? Eat fish instead of what would be ground beef and red meat and other things that would be sent across the Atlantic. All right, so what does all this do? It leads towards silencing the anti-war effort. Okay, so this effort to change people's minds could change the world for a positive in the future. You could lead towards more democracies. You could lead towards more free trade. You could lead towards more freedom and less monarchies or dictatorships or some sort of cruel regimes that they were depicting as the enemies. What does this do for women? Right? They start volunteering, they start working, and they start conserving all of these things in the effort to win the war, and they see it as a positive change for themselves. So it might bring them the right to vote, and they were correct within this. There's some of the efforts that I just told you that they did. All right, then, besides all the volunteer stuff, you do have the Selective Service Act. In June 1917, Congress approved of this, which allows then the government to force you into military service if you are selected. So 10 million men, ages 21 through 35, registered for the draft. Today, it starts at 18. So, a funny little story, when I turned 18, they sent me the registration card, right? And I thought about not sending it back, but I did, so don't not do it, otherwise you could be in big trouble. All right, back to the show. So you can see the statistics here. 12% failed to show up. Okay, so either they left the country or they didn't sign up as they were supposed to, and if they got selected, then they didn't show up. All that contributes towards the 12%. 2.8 million eventually were called by lottery. Okay, so 2.8 million were selected through this service. Draftees provided over half of the total 4.7 million Americans who were issued uniforms. That doesn't mean 4.7 fought. It just means that they were in training or had some sort of role within the military within the United States, or the other part that went across and actually fought. So 2 million transported overseas. Here's some things about Americans in battle. You don't really need to know this stuff for the quiz or the test or AP test. This is just kind of fun facts. African Americans suffered the greatest limitations and extreme segregation within racism as well. So they weren't allowed to fight alongside whites. They had to fight in their own black units, and they had white officers that were in charge of them. All Americans were separated from the British and the French. The French had their own, the British had their own, the United States had their own, but they were all allies and fought together against the Germans, but they didn't fight side by side. The general for the United States was John J. Pershing. 52,000 Americans died in battle. 60,000 died from disease. 200,000 were wounded. Here's all of these statistics for all of these other countries. So these were the Allied forces, the United States side. And you can see Russia has the largest number of casualties there. On this side, it's 76% of its people. Total mobilized forces, 12 million. 9 million of them were casualties of war. The United States has the smallest, well, I mean, these other ones that were underneath the United States didn't send a whole lot of people, but the United States sent 4 million or uniformed soldiers, mobilized forces, 7% casualties. Again, they were in the war for the least amount. The Russians will also have their Russian Revolution. They will back out of the war, so they're out by 2 years before the war even ends. So within those first years of 1914 to 1917, that's where the majority of those Russian casualties existed. On the other side, this is the Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Turkey, and Bulgaria too, with their numbers that they mobilized and their casualties. Check out Austria-Hungary with 90% of their forces ending up as casualties of war. That's a very high rate of casualties. So what are they doing at home? While these guys are fighting abroad, I mentioned that women will be working, and we'll see more African Americans working as well. So the demand for workers was extremely high. You need production. That always happens in a war. So if you see stuff on the AP test, like that, there are commonalities amongst all these different wars that the United States gets involved in, yes, it will increase production. It will increase then the need for workers. Okay? So within that, you get better pay and higher standards of living. Let's talk about the unions then. So union membership, right? They always associated unions with anti-capitalist, anti-American, anti-democracy sentiments. They were always connected to like anarchy and socialism, right? So during the war, union membership will increase. That's the need for workers. then leads towards unions having more power. The federal government works to solve these problems between unions and employers because most of the federal government bought these industries to be able to create the war materials so they can be able to increase wages and stop strikes because they need production. Immigration decline, we talked about that. We can put that in there. And women go to work more skilled jobs. As 4 million men go into uniform, that opens up tons of jobs. Women will take a part of that. The other part, then, those that were closed to other minorities, mostly blacks at that time. All right, so in regards to those African Americans, this is referred to as the Great Migration in the South, where most of these African Americans were after the Civil War, producing most of the still crops that existed in the South. They will start to move out of the South during the late 19 teens and 1920s, and then continuing after that, leaving the South for better job opportunities in the North. Now, this doesn't solve much socially, but economically it will provide some benefits to African Americans that were not offered prior to the war. After the war, again, a lot of these jobs will go away, which will cause some other issues, but we'll talk about that when we get to the 1920s. But no, the Great Migration, test, quiz, AP test, it happens because mostly as a cause of from the World War I. Okay, so women get the right to vote. They support the war, they work in men's jobs, and they work on all these volunteering efforts, which leads to the 19th Amendment, women's right to vote. You should know that. It existed before in states, but this becomes federally a part of the Constitution. All right, public health. So you have some advancements during the Progressive Era about health. We talked about eugenics and birth control, that kind of stuff in the last unit. So sexually transmitted diseases were a problem, and you're going to send men over into a foreign country. And so the government said, let's not allow the passing on of these diseases to occur. And so alongside their boots and their uniforms and their guns, they were also issued condoms. Daycare was allowed for working women, provided for working women, so they could work and the kids could be taken care of at the same time. Just like the coronavirus of 2020, there was a huge flu which killed 20 million people worldwide. Now, they had no idea what was happening, and there's no way in which they could stop it. Well, at least they didn't have a way that was effective in which they could try to stop it back then. So it was mostly ignored by the federal government in the United States and elsewhere, just as something that might pass through. It also leads to the Prohibition era. So this is the elimination of alcohol from society. This is what reformers had wanted from the early 1800s, to try to get men to stop drinking, to eliminate the physical abuse, the monetary issues that happen from losing money, from spending it so much on alcohol, and all the violence and the crime and things that were connected to alcoholism. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, was behind this for a long period of time, and they finally got what they wanted, which will become the 18th Amendment. Remember that the war is happening, and everything that was CPI stuff said that German stuff was bad, right? So Germans made a lot of beer. And beer, according to the Women's Christian Temperance Union and these other reformers, was bad. Therefore, you connect the two, you make a larger movement against beer or hard alcohol. So wheat goes into making beer, and wheat goes into some other alcoholic drinks. So you need it for food, not for beer. It all worked together, which led towards the 18th Amendment, which banned alcohol. Oh, did I go too fast? There you go. 18th Amendment. When you're 18, you can't drink. Remember it that way. So stop doing it. Alright, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. Right? All these beautiful women saying that if you drink alcohol, then you can't have a kiss. The American issue, this newspaper, has headlines declaring the United States voted dry. No alcohol. Here's some guys pouring some out for the homies. Other homies that actually wanted beer. So large protests to this Prohibition era. We'll get into that in the 20s in more depth, but you can see a resistance to that, natural resistance. All right, last section here of this video, legal intimidation. The Espionage Act was passed in 1917, prohibited spying. Okay, so a big fear within the United States government is people within the United States that might help the enemy. You have that large population of Germans. You have a bunch of people that were considered anti-American through their socialist efforts, the unions and people like that, right? So an attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States. Also looking at the Selective Service Act. So if you didn't participate, there you go. You can be fined and put in prison for up to 20 years. Okay, so it's known as the Espionage Act, spying. Then you have the Sabotage Act. Any effort that was used to be able to prevent production, okay, and again that could be targeting unions, right, and their strikes and things that would stop the production of military supplies and shipment of military supplies to places that need to go. So that IWW, that's the radical unions that the United States wants to be able to control during this era of the war. Then you have the Sedition Act. Sedition, stuff you say and print, right? So prohibited writing and uttering of anything disloyal, profane, or abusive language about the form of government. Okay, so again, just like, yes, those alien sedition acts all the way back to Adam's times, where it said you couldn't say bad stuff about the government, here it is again. You're like, what about the First Amendment? Yeah, what about the First Amendment? You're going to read about that stuff in your documents, so hang on to those thoughts. So this one eventually leads towards the creation of the FBI, being able to investigate those that might be subversive to the United States government in war times. Again, we can look at the Constitution and say that that's possible with the suspension of some of these issues to protect the entire government or the entire society in some ways. All right, so you have some Supreme Court cases that you need to know. You're going to read about Schenck here in just a second in your documents. But Schenck was the secretary of the Socialist Party. Yes, there was a Socialist Party. If you remember those little white pies that we look at in our political maps for the Electoral College. Yep, those are those little white pies. Okay, so here you have activities mailing anti-draft leaflets to Philadelphia area conscripts, which then was considered by the Supreme Court a violation of the Espionage Act. And the use of the defense of this in the judge's discernment was that words can constitute a clear and present danger, and that still exists today. Okay, so clear and present danger could be fire in a crowded place, right? If you threaten somebody or something, that could be considered clear and present danger as well. So be careful what you say. The First Amendment doesn't apply to everything. Debs versus the United States, another Supreme Court case. Eugene Debs was the American Railway Union socialist leader, and so he ran for president. He was a lot of those white pies who people were voting for. Here he is upheld with a conviction for anti-war speech. Okay, so stuff he said in Canton, Ohio, that was urging people to not be a participant within the draft, the Selective Service Act of the United States. So he was convicted for violations of that. Then you have Abrams versus the United States, the third of these three major ones. And within this, the anarchist Russian immigrant Jacob Abrams was printing out stuff in English and in Yiddish, condemning Woodrow Wilson for sending troops to Russia. So in this case, the United States determined that he's looking at a general strike. Okay. And again, the United States gets to determine this stuff, so you can read in your documents whether these people were actual threats to the United States or not. You can figure that out and decide either way. But he was convicted of both the sabotage and sedition acts because of this printing of this information. All right, here you go. Back to the Google Classroom. Were critics of World War I anti-American or not? Read the documents, answer the questions, have fun. See you next time on Clark TV.